My wife is a dermatologist. So two doctor family, and over the years we've gotten into real estate. And I started a small development company a couple of years ago called Terrain Development Partners. And we buy and hold properties. We've done some development, and so that's sort of the background into real estate. And I've got a number of good friends in the community who I've done projects with. And so I'll kind of fast forward to summer of 2021, and I'm still sort of practicing medicine and doing real estate on the side. And there's a hospital in St. Paul called St. Joseph's Hospital, and it was a large downtown hospital for many years that the decision was made to close the hospital. And right across the street from this hospital was a large professional building called Gallery Professional Building, and for many years it had housed specialties, orthopedic surgeons, gynecologists, family practice doctors, a large 8-story 120 some thousand square foot building. And I happened to notice that there was a sign sort of saying, for sale. And so I looked it up online, and, it was interesting. They were marketing the business or the building as an office building. And I remember sort of thinking, gosh, it doesn't seem like that's how I would market it, because it's, you're across from this hospital that's closing down. It's not a medical office anymore. I mean, you're not going to have much use for a medical office building. And long story short, the REIT that owned it was going to sell it as an auction. And so I called up one of my good friends, Nick Walton of Reuter Walton. They do a lot of local development. I said, hey, Nick, I'm like, at what price would you buy this big downtown building? There's so much we could do with this. I was like, I feel like, at the right price, we could do a lot with this. We could make it into housing. And so we sort of kicked around some ideas, and I said, well, why don't we put in an offer at the auction of $500,000 or $600,000, and of course it's never going to go for that low a price, right? Somebody's going to come in and buy this. To build a building like that, concrete construction would cost you $15-20 million at least. So fast forward, long story short, we go to the auction, and we're the only ones that show up, and the online auction, and we put in a bid for $600,000, and we got it. So it's like, oh my gosh, okay, now we suddenly own this big downtown 8-story building. And Reuter Walton has done a lot of affordable housing developments, and that was originally our plan. We really said, well, this would be a great building for us to convert into affordable housing. And so we sort of set to work on that. We hired architects, we started making plans, and most importantly, sort of started to apply for funding. And luckily there was a number of good funding sources. And so we started going down this path, and we secured a grant for $1 million for affordable housing. And we needed to get a little bit more funding, and we were well on the way to sort of doing that. But one of the things we noticed was just like, it's a tough neighborhood. And as I'm driving by, this is across the street from another hospital in St. Paul, United Hospital, where I was operating. I'd drive by and I'd see these tents all set up along the sidewalk, of homeless people that needed housing. And it's very close to, there's a very large Catholic Charities has a beautiful shelter that they built years ago. And so the building is very close to that, and there'd be overflow from the shelter. There's just not enough beds. And anyway, long story short, sort of thinking about this, and one of the things that I do with my children, we have 5 kids, and my oldest 2 boys and I were driving around. We'll often drive around and talk real estate. It's one of my most fun things to do with the kids. We'll talk about projects, and I'll pick their brain about stuff. And I was telling them, like, guys, this is such a tough spot. I was like, I'm like, yes, we can make this into affordable housing, and that's certainly a great play, but it's going to take all these years to do it. And it's we'll get it done. But I'm like, as I look around, I'm like, look at the need for homeless. I'm like, this really should be a homeless shelter. It's a good location. The demand is there. You have overflow from not enough beds. And I was like, well, but I'm like, I was like, I don't know anything about running a homeless shelter. That is a huge undertaking. Like, I'm a doctor, I know how to operate, and we do real estate, but I'm like, this is a whole nother thing. And my 11-year-old Kai, he just kind of looks up from, whatever he was reading his book, or probably, stealing my phone and on screen time, and kind of looks up and he says, well, what if you just donated it? Just like that, just casually, what if you just donated it? And suddenly, like, this light bulb went off in my head. I'm like, donated it? I'm like, what a great idea. I was just like, obviously he wasn't thinking about all the different reasons why that was good. In his mind, he's like, well, if you can't run a homeless shelter, give it to somebody that can, right? And so I called up my buddy Nick and I said, hey Nick, I'm like, certainly we can keep going down this path, and I think that would be great. But I'm like, well, what if we did donate it? I'm like, we got this at a very low basis, an extremely attractive basis. Clearly, the building is worth a lot more than what we paid for it, especially if we look at its best and highest use. And I said, I'm sure the demand is there. I mean, there's plenty of nonprofits that would love to have this, this resource, especially in such a good urban location. So then we were kind of off to the races, sort of exploring this possibility. And, one of the things in real estate is, you often run parallel paths. So we were kind of like, well, let's keep running down the path of affordable. And while we do that, let's explore what a donation would look like. And we also said, well, what would a sale look like? So we kind of were looking at all these things at the same time. And, long story short, we talked to the CPAs and the tax attorneys, and they told us all the steps that we would have to do. And, we can get a little bit more into that. And then was the next step of, well, let's see if anybody wants this building. Is this, and so we, made appointments to speak with a number of nonprofits. We got a very good reception. Several were very excited about it. And so we almost had like I don't want to call it a competition. It was like an interview process. It's just like you interview for a job. And Salvation Army was the one that really, I mean, there's so many great, and we could have certainly given it to a number of wonderful charities in the Twin Cities, but Salvation Army, they own a number of buildings, they have a number of shelters. And so they're already doing this in other locations, and they really wanted to establish a presence in St. Paul. So they were very excited about it. So we had a couple meetings with them, and they sent a number of people from their organization to walk the building and look at it and think about plans. And long story short, they sort of decided, yes, we would love to have this, so we bought the building in, I think September of 2021. So this is about a year later. And we said, well, great, if we can do it, let's do it before the end of the year, because then we can, take the tax deduction in that year. And so that's kind of the story in a nutshell. I'm happy to get into more details about it, but that's the long and the short of it.
Well, thank you for that. Tell us about the appraised value, and without getting too much into your nitty-gritty business, what kind of a tax deduction that was compared to what you actually paid for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we paid, I said about 600,000. One of the things that people don't realize is when they see, wow, this building is so cheap. And I think about the story when the Pontiac Silverdome back in the day sold for $500,000, and people are like, wow, this stadium is selling for, but what people don't realize is there's a lot of carrying costs for a big building like this, right? And the biggest one is the real estate taxes, and just to heat the building and, all of those things. So, we bought the building for 600,000. In a typical year, just to carry that building is, about $500,000 to $600,000. So our total investment up to a year, and we expected that, we sort of built that into our pro forma for development, but we were about in different appraisals. The appraisals came in somewhere between $4 and $5 million. So, if you do some really rough math, obviously it depends on your tax bracket and your individual tax situation. But I typically say is, you divide that number by about 2.5, and that's the number of dollars you can actually save, so you can take the whole deduction. Let's say the appraised value is like 4 million, right? So you can take a $4 million deduction, which ends up being like, about 1.5, 1.6 million, something like that back in your pocket. So at that point, that was sort of our break even. So long story short, we broke even, and in theory, we're a little bit actually positive, in the grand scheme of things. But that wasn't, obviously that wasn't our primary motivation. As it turned out, as we got closer to the donation date, a couple of things kind of came out of the woodworks. We got an unsolicited offer to sell the building for $4 million. Which of course you had to think about it, like, wow, like, okay, that clearly would have been better than the donation. And we also had a large, public health group reach out to us about wanting to rent a couple floors from us for a health clinic. But ultimately we sort of decided that we really thought the best use would be with a nonprofit like the Salvation. There's so much that they could do with it. And so we ultimately decided to continue down that path, even though, of course, you had to think about the sale for a second. But I think as a general rule of thumb, you can sort of do the math, you can have your CPA look at it. But if you're in a tax situation where you can use the tax write-off, which many of us can, you can typically take the appraised value, and there's, of course, a number of CPA hoops and things you have to jump through and appraisals and everything. But you can essentially, it's no different than making a donation of, some sort of a good that has any kind of value, or even making a cash donation, to your favorite charity. You just have to have a certified appraisal, and then you deduct that amount, on your annual taxes.
Well, and with this being an asset, and an asset that had appreciated, there's the capital gains tax and several other things, of course, the CPA has to tell you, but people will ask us all the time, do people really donate real estate, or who would donate real estate, or why would they donate real estate? So I love that your story is, first and foremost, you did it because it's philanthropic, and that was what was speaking to your heart to begin with. And then secondly, the tax benefit was pretty good too. And thirdly, it was your son that made the suggestion. Man, kudos to you for having your children in that conversation to even be a part of it,
Well, his joke is, he's like, hey, whenever it ends up being the final product, can they put my name on the building somewhere on a wing? I said, I'll find a plaque somewhere for you, buddy. Don't worry about it. So
now, do you have intentions of doing any more real estate donations, or?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something now that we sort of know about it, as you mentioned, it is a great tool. And, as we read so much these days about the change away from office, people working from home, and you're finding a lot of these urban buildings that are having vacancies, and some office buildings that may be totally vacant. And one of the things I think landlords and owners should understand is, it's an option to think about. And especially if you have, let's say you own an office building and now your tenants have moved out, and, at this point, your basis was very low. You bought it 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And, rather than potentially sell it and all the recapture on the depreciation, make some phone calls to the nonprofits in your community. I mean, there's probably many, many nonprofits or charities that would be happy to either have office space that essentially they're getting for free, or are exempt from paying real estate taxes. May be very advantageous for, let's say there's even a nonprofit that says, gosh, we could really use some office space, and you have this small office building. It's such a win-win, right? You donate it to them, you get the write-off, and you can get it appraised for its highest and best use. And maybe you don't make as much money as you would on a sale, but certainly it's a conversation. You can certainly, and sometimes you can get just as well, you do just as well, or break even, or but if you can make it a win-win like that, and then you create this, gift for, an organization that you care about that can really do something great with it. So there's a lot of wins in there, right? Like, you get to do something good with it. You get the tax write-off from it. It gets put to use. Now it's not sitting vacant anymore. So I think that's one of the real risks in some of these. When a vacant building is not a good thing, right? It's just it's deteriorating. People can get into all kinds of trouble. But a building that's activated, and having, even if it's a nonprofit that's using half of the office space, just having them there using that building, they're getting a building for free. There's just so much good. So it's one of the things I would encourage on the commercial side, for some of these landlords who have these buildings. They're like, gosh, do I want to go and invest and kind of repurpose this? Or can you give it to an organization that could turn it into affordable housing that has the resources to do that? So there's a lot of really, really good uses that you could do for some of these buildings that, replacement costs would be insane. Even with our gallery building, to build an 8-story building now downtown St. Paul, I mean, it would be exorbitantly expensive. We're talking $15 or $20 million. Well, the charity is getting it for free. And yes, they're going to spend some money to renovate it or do whatever they want, but it's such a head start, right? You're basically getting the building for free. So.
Well, and you and I, when we spoke last week, I was mentioning that there was just recently another story about a group in Birmingham, Alabama, exactly what you're talking about. They had a huge 200,000 square foot building that was built for training facility for the bank. And for 4 years, it sat vacant. And the developer was smart enough to keep up appearances and landscaping, everything, electricity, et cetera. So you'd never know it was vacant, but ultimately it was bleeding them dry. And they donated the whole building because that specific nonprofit did want a training facility. They want to train other ministers and people in church. But I want to make sure that our viewers know that while buildings can be donated to be used by the nonprofit, what we at the Real Agents of Change are helping to bring awareness to, even if your nonprofit doesn't want a building, doesn't need real estate at all, but what you do need is funding. The property owner can still donate the building. And the way we do it, it's donated through a third party, credible facilitator, if you will. We call them a specialized nonprofit. And when they take title to the property, it gives the donor the tax benefit, just like when you donated it to the Salvation Army, they donate it to this third party. They get the same tax benefits, but now these third parties are educated, and all they do is facilitate gifts of real estate, sell them, and give. And some, depending on the specialized nonprofit, the percentage, but usually 90% or more of the proceeds go to the nonprofit that the donor designates. So you don't even have to be a nonprofit that's looking for office space. If you're just looking for cash, let your donors know. Just tell them, hey, this is an option.
That's a great point. And it's such a great estate planning tool too, right? I mean, I think we talked about this too, is, let's say you've got a family cabin or, something that's been in the family and now your kids have moved away and nobody's using this cabin and it's sort of paid for and has value. Yeah, you could certainly sell it. But if you're planning on donating to your church or your school or whatever, charitable organization, something like that is wonderful, right? Give to the intermediate organization that can take the real estate, they can sell it and give the money to your church or to your school or to your local shelter or whatever. It's something, I don't think people ever realize that, as you said. So it's not something you sort of think about. You just think about, well, and a lot of times I think one of the benefits is you can give with a warm hand, right? I mean, so many times people pass away and then the family is left to sort of figure out, okay, well, I guess we'll sell the cabin and we'll do this with it. And like, if you have causes that you're passionate about and you want to give, it's so nice to see the fruits of your donation, right? And so, if it is your house and or maybe you're downsizing to an apartment and you don't need your family house anymore, and you say, gosh, I know I'm going to leave all my money to the, the local school or the local church or the whatever. What a great way to do that, right? I'm gonna donate it. It's going to get sold, and the money will go right to wherever I want it to go to. And it's something that's okay. Even before I talked to you, I never thought of it that way. But you're right. The end user doesn't have to be the church or the school or the Red Cross or whoever. They can sell it and they can get the money off of it. So.
Well, I love that you use that word fruit, because I say that a lot too, because sometimes people will say, are you talking about when people die? And I say, well, they can wait till they die, but how great would it be to see the fruit of your labor, to the fruits that you have created, feeding, literally feeding the nonprofit, and watch it right in this red hot moment, whether you want your name, put on a plaque and there's ego there, or whether you're just, want to do it anonymously. Because that's another thing I'd like for people to hear. Some people want to be known for their donations. Some people like yourself aren't doing it to be known, but if people know, that's okay. But then there's other people who maybe they don't want people to know, because whether they don't want people saying, hey, you got all those buildings, why don't you give us some of it? Or whether they just don't, for whatever reason, they want to be anonymous. And what we want to say is you can be anonymous, and you can even donate real estate, have it facilitated, and not even have a nonprofit in mind. In other words, if you just need a tax deduction this year and to stretch it out over the next 5 years, you can put the money in a donor advised fund and give $500 or $5,000 or $500,000 as you see fit,
I
and
think
give it to your children.
That's a really good point too, Cami, is that, one of the things that drove our decision too, and we talked about, we could have sold it, but it's very clean and it can happen pretty quickly, right? So like, let's say it's October or November and you're like, gosh, I have some gains, and, yes, I could sell it, but, between due diligence and all of the things that it takes to close, especially in commercial real estate, it may take 6 months. And there's many things that can happen along the way, as opposed to once you've identified a donor, whether it's the intermediary or whether it's the end user, that can happen pretty quickly, right? Once they realize, with Salvation Army, it's like they just needed to know that, they sent their structural engineers, and of course they made sure the building was, in great shape and what they wanted. But once all that was done, it's much, the donation is actually pretty simple. You're not signing your life away like when you're going to a real estate closing and financing with the bank. It's actually, I was like, wow, that's it. You literally just sign a piece of paper. It's like one piece of paper. You sort of sign it over, and the county, records it or whatever. And it was like, I'm like, wow, that was pretty easy. It's like, selling your car or something like that. It's just really simple, and so it can happen pretty quickly. And so that's one thing I would encourage people, if you're thinking about a donation, whether it's your house or whether it's whatever real estate is, that it can happen relatively quickly without some of the uncertainty of like, well, when is my house going to sell? When is, if you're like, rather than sell your house and then sort of donate it, you donate the money. I mean, this is a much cleaner and easier way sometimes to do that. And it's very predictable. You can be like, well, I'm going to make the donation on December 10th. I'll get the donation in this tax year, as opposed to like, well, I might list it. It might take 6 months to sell, all those kinds of things. You can take some of that uncertainty out of it and sort of, plan your financial year a little bit better, so to speak.
I'm glad you bring that up, because it is the convenience, the take this off my hands factor. One of the stories that we share about a woman that was donating $25 a year for 32 years. So when we say that the donors that we are looking for are cash conservative and asset abundant, they don't have to be Bill Gates. They don't have to be Mackenzie Scott. They don't have to be uber wealthy. This lady was donating $25 a year for 32 years. That's definitely cash conservative. But then she learned that she could donate real estate, had that second cabin in the Poconos. And when I talked to the fundraising professional a couple of years ago about this whole process, she said, Cami, Linda donated that building because it was convenient, because the cabin had fallen into disrepair. Frankly, the electricity and the plumbing didn't even work. She had to drive 6 hours from her house to even visit her cabin. She had to get a hotel room because it wasn't even really livable. She didn't want to deal with hiring contractors and, God forbid, home inspections and all that stuff. She was just like, wow, you mean I can actually leave the legacy I want to leave and be rid of that building? Yes, you can. So sometimes it is the convenience of it.
Yep.
Well, we just want to thank you for giving us your time today, for giving your building, and for being someone who is so philanthropic. Our good friend Jim Wooten, who wrote the book Real Estate Gift, is very implicit when he says there must be philanthropic intention, not only on the IRS side. In other words, when you make an offer of donating a building, it has to state it right there that this donor has philanthropic intention. So not only is it kind of a legal thing, but it's a heart thing too, because to your point, you could have sold the building, and after capital gains and et cetera, you could have put hundreds of thousands of dollars in your pocket, but it was your heart-centered nature that had you do the right thing with the building. And that was the whole purpose of doing this interview, because if just one person sees this and it gives them an idea that their 11-year-old didn't need to give them, and they decide to donate a building, it is a domino effect, and they will get interviewed. The next thing you know, there's 2 more donations and 3 more and 5 and 10. Right now, friends, real estate is being donated to nonprofits, has been for over 100 years since it was put into the tax code. 9 billion with a B is donated every year, but it's a really small percentage when you consider how much nonprofits bring in. The goal here, by all experts' estimation, is to go from 9 billion to 29 billion, because 43% of our wealth is held in real estate. So just watching this video has made you more educated. And if you will share this with the executive director, with the fundraiser, with the people at your board of realtors, because we're teaching realtors to bring this to their community. If you just click share, it's free to do that, and you never know what nonprofit is going to get millions of dollars from a piece of real estate. Do you have any other thoughts for us before we close up?
No, thanks for doing this, and thanks for the message. It's a great message, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So thanks for all you do.
Well, thank you. Thanks, friends. See you next time on the Real Agents of Change. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cami.